Great. Welcome, everybody. My name is Josh Schoop. I'm the Principal Director for Innovation and Technology based here in Washington, D.C. at an organization called the Federation of American Scientists. I've spent a lot of time working in federal agencies and with civil servants across the federal government about trying to help people and organizations improve their use of innovation, improve their efficiency and effectiveness, and thinking a lot about something called human-centered design. So just offer that by way of background about me, and just kind of as I come into this, some of the things that I think about, really draw on that background and history of engaging people like yourselves across government. So today we're going to focus on persuasive writing, writing a killer memo. Some of you may have seen the videos that we pass along in advance. But really at its core, persuasive writing is about trying to compel or encourage action from somebody else. So trying to leverage the way you communicate in text to spur and spark action from another person. So that could be a boss, it could be a friend who you're trying to encourage to join your organization. It could be a policymaker out there, which is often what I do, that you're trying to encourage to take up and think about how to implement and take action on an idea that you care a lot about. So there are a number of different ways that we think about trying to encourage action and compel action through our writing. And so today I'm going to take you through a few slides that kind of communicate some of the ways I think about persuasive writing. I will try my best to ground it in the reality of where you sit. We recognize that you all come from very different places, very diverse group of people in terms of where you sit inside of government, what state governments you sit in. I mean, we deliver trainings, as Graham mentioned in his note here, across the country, to people in California and Colorado, New Jersey, Maine, and Pennsylvania, people that sit inside of all different offices, work with politicals, work with all sorts of different people and constituents. So my hope is that through these slides, I can deliver some thinking for you and some best practices on how to write compelling, persuasive emails, policy proposals, deliver presentations, basically anything that you might be doing. I think this framework and these tips and techniques can help you compel action in another person or an audience that you're aspiring to reach. So I'm going to share some slides right now. Just bear with me while I pull those up. And then just in terms of our flow and run a show, I'm going to walk you through some of the ways I think about this. I would encourage you to add questions in the chat as we go forward. I will try to make this as interactive as possible, but given that we're on Zoom and this is quite a large group, we'll do our best to make that happen and make you all feel connected to what we're covering today. I hope that this is at least in some ways a two-way communication, and that I'm not just talking at you, that we're talking with each other. So please encourage you to use the chat. Jump in if you have questions as much as you're willing. So here, I'm just going to share my slides now. Okay, Graham, is that in full screen mode for you?
No, I can see your thumbnails
Okay.
on the side of the notes at the bottom.
There we go. Okay.
Perfect. That's full screen.
So just as I mentioned, quick agenda. And just to start, I was hoping that everybody could just share a short bio. I know we did this in our intake in your sign up for the class, but your name, your role, where you sit in your organization. This is helpful as we go through the discussion for me to think about where you sit, because I think in a lot of ways that informs maybe some of the challenges you might be facing day to day as you aspire to improve your own persuasive writing. And then if you have a hope for your own writing, it can really be anything. I want to learn how to write better emails to my boss. I'm inspired by working on an issue in my community and want to try to connect with a policymaker, whatever it looks like. Feel free to drop that in as well. And then as we go through, I'll try to return to those as much as possible. Graham is going to be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions, drop them in there and he'll make sure I'll pause and make sure we have time to address them as we go through. And then again, just to emphasize our agenda, I'm going to go through some specifics on how we think about persuasive writing. I have a couple activities that I hope we can walk through as a group, and then we'll save some time at the end for any last questions and ways you can follow up with us. I'm just going to check the chat here as we go through. Thank you, everybody. And yes, we'll have a copy of the slides and share all these materials after. Great. So my goals for this session, I started to hint at this, but let's chat out of the way. Sorry. Stuck. Bear with me here a moment. Having some technical problems with this chat. Just gonna have to deal. So I'd like to leave you all with some specific ideas on how to improve your persuasive writing with an emphasis on writing a killer memo. As I mentioned, I'll share a template in this slide deck with you. I think in a lot of ways, the deck in itself can serve as a guide for you. So as you start to think about, maybe you want to take on writing a policy document for your supervisor about why you should introduce a new piece of technology into your organization, or whatever it is that you're trying to do, that this is something that can really sit alongside of you as you do your writing, and that you can sift through and as you're looking for ideas and tips and tricks. And then I hope we can take you through a couple examples where you can actually apply some of this in practice. And I'll show you some samples of my own writing that we can draw on. So this is, just give me a second here. There we go. Okay, so as I said, and we shared a few of these in our sample readings in advance of the course, but there's many different elements to persuasive writing. There's some basic ingredients in the ways that we all think about how to do this in our own writing. It is certainly both an art and a science, in that it's a bit of creativity, a bit of innovation in the way you think about it, a bit of design, but is also, there is a science to it, and that there is a very structured process that you can follow to improve your own writing and provide yourself the types of structure and scaffolding that you might actually need to improve the ability for you to compel action in somebody else. So just to take you through a few of these bullets. So ideas can actually serve as currency. So I often think of an idea or something that's written in a document as a down payment on a future conversation when you're thinking about persuasive writing. So what do I mean by that? The document or email or memo is in essence something that you can send and share out to somebody. But what you're really trying to do is utilize that document to get in front of the person, to sit with them and talk about your ideas. But the design of the document actually matters a lot in whether or not they are willing to listen to what you have to say. So your ability to communicate in whatever it is you're writing improves the success that that person on the receiving end is actually going to act on what you're asking them to do. Written communication, and I'm sure you all have seen this over time in your own work and writing, that it is something we can all get better at. The more you do it, the better you get. The more diversity of type of writing that you try to do, the better you get. Your creative writing. I have a background in academia, so I spent a lot of time writing journal articles and thinking about scientific writing. Trying to write a periodical for a newspaper. Any of these different outputs can actually help you get better at any kind of writing. The more you do it, the more practice you put into it, the better you get, just like with anything. there's a few basic things that I think any sort of persuasive writing can really, that will help strengthen and encourage the person on the receiving end to act and do what you're asking them to do. So if in your writing, if you're able to show credibility and who you are and your character, so if it's related to something in your office and you're trying to give feedback, drawing on your own expertise or things that you've done in your history or past that can help show the audience that you actually have some knowledge and capabilities around the issue area that you're focused on. We often think about in persuasive writing how you can use it, carve a narrative to tell a story. So really try to appeal to the person on the receiving end. In the organization that I help lead, we think a lot about customer design. So using things from like marketing and the way businesses think about marketing products to people. How can you think about marketing your idea to another person? So the other person being in persuasive writing, who's out there that's ready to receive your idea, and what do you know about them? And how in the way that you write in an email or in a memo or in a document, what can you include that will help appeal to what that person cares about, to who they are, to what they might be facing day to day in their job, to the constraints that they face as a boss, as a policymaker, and how can you utilize your document to tell a story or a narrative that actually appeals to that person. So through the writing, telling the story, you should try to build interest. So again, connect to that person on the receiving end. What do you know about them and why should they care? This is where some of the science might come into it, or using evidence and data to back up what it is that you're trying to communicate. And I'll say a little bit more about that as we go forward. Being concise in your writing and using brevity, so short, direct language. This is something that I think very much takes practice. Not everybody is good at it at first, but how can you say in a short, concise way what some people might take pages and pages to say? How can you boil it down and condense it into a paragraph? What's the most important points that you would want the person on the receiving end to know? How can you communicate that in a way that also appeals to their emotions and keeps them interested in what you have to say? So make it easy. If you're trying to get somebody to act on something, don't just explain to them why it's important or what they can do about it. Actually tell them how they can do it. How can you make it as easy as possible for the person on the receiving end to actually take on your suggestions? Give them a roadmap, how change can be incited, and make it easy for them to execute. Sorry, I lost my screen. So another thing in writing that we see a lot is if you're going to talk about trying to persuade somebody, you want to clearly articulate what the current state or current problem as you see it might be. So here's the issue inside our organization. Here's what you boss, you policymaker can do about it. So in that, making very clear what the problem is or the opportunity as you see it, and here's the way that you policymaker, you boss can actually solve that problem. So making it very clear for the person, again, make it easy for them to understand what you're trying to say and how they could do something about it. And I think I mentioned this already, but really knowing your customer, so knowing the person that you're writing to in persuasive writing. So trying to actually envision and think through who is the person on the other end of this. They're sitting there at their desk, they're sitting there in their office, they're sitting there in the state capitol building, wherever. What do you know about them? If you don't know anything about them, what can you do? How can you be creative in doing research or calling people or talking to colleagues to better understand who they are, so that as you write something, you have a clearer understanding of what's going to compel them to act? What are some of the things, the potential landmines or pitfalls of things you might want to avoid including in a piece of writing? And how can you use a process, a structured process, to learn more about what they think about your idea before you even hit send on that email? So I'm going to just pause there and see if you all have any questions. So anything from the chat, Graham?
No, not yet.
Okay, great.
Folks should also feel free to, well, I'll let Josh say, but I think folks should feel free to unmute or to share
Yeah.
questions in the chat. Both are great.
Yeah, unmute, use the hand raise. Feel free, like, as I said off the top, I'm hoping that we can be conversational here, but I also recognize this is a bigger group, and it's also probably post lunch for many of you on a Tuesday afternoon. So, but we'll keep going, but please encourage you to use the chat or raise your hand or come off mute. So now those were what we just covered were some of the basics. So how can you compel action in writing? Now let's get into the specifics of what components of any sort of successful output might look like. And I think I breezed through this before, and I apologize, but just here are some of the specific outputs that we saw in the submissions that you all sent and signing up for this course of things that you might be interested in thinking about improving your writing, your persuasive writing on. So the types of outputs that you're seeking to create. If there isn't an output here that you're thinking about, please feel free to add it into the chat, because I'd like to include it for the next time we run this course and make sure that we can address it as we go forward if it's something that maybe we overlooked. So as we think about any of those successful outputs, whether it's an email, a memo, a presentation, these are the basic components that we feel helps create a successful piece of persuasive writing. So I was just checking the chat. Okay. So at the beginning, the first thing, and some people, sometimes this is called a summary statement or summary of the document, but really the bluff statement, as we call it, the bottom, or this stands for bottom line up front. It's an acronym, or it can be referred to as the pitch, depending on the document. Maybe you're trying to raise money from a funder, or maybe you're trying to pitch your boss on having extended lunchtime hours or whatever it is. This is the statement up front in a short 2 to 5 sentence paragraph that is a very punchy opening, outlining the basics of whatever it is you're trying to communicate. So if I were to just read that part of your email, I would know exactly what you're asking me to do and what I can do about it. So it's a condensed message that you are that communicates the core and the essence of whatever it is that you're trying to persuade your audience to do. From there, as I talked about in the last slide, started in the idea of a problem solution alignment. So thinking through what exactly is the problem or opportunity or challenge as you see it, and how can you summarize that in a paragraph and whatever is your solution to that problem. So this can be called problem definition or opportunity statement, depending on where you sit and whatever you're thinking through. It is a summary of the problem and your solution to that problem. And this is often where you can start to think about being creative, and why I say it's part art and part science, is that you can start to be creative about how you would utilize evidence or data targeted towards that audience. So thinking through exactly what kinds of data or evidence would this person want to see that is going to help illustrate the problem or opportunity that you're trying to push them to solve. So a good example of that from my own work, I was working on a proposal about a year ago with somebody who was trying to advance computer science education. So basically, their goal was to make computer science education universal in the United States. So they were trying to write a policy document for people at the Department of Education here in DC to persuade them that they should think about integrating and diffusing computer science across all K-12 in the United States. So this person was thinking about, at the time, it was on the heels of the previous presidential administration, the Trump administration. So the Trump administration was still in office. And so this person was thinking in their original draft about framing this as a problem of connected to diversity. So we need to make sure we do not leave talent on the table. All Americans no matter where they come from, especially those in marginalized communities, deserve access to computer science education. So that is one framing that you might think about writing this problem around. Another might be, and this is where the person ultimately landed, because they started to think about, what does the Trump administration care about? How can I align my idea with what they might be thinking about? So the person pushed the problem statement to be more about a national security issue. We as a country are competing to produce technology and for economic competitiveness on a global scale. We need to invest in computer science education to make sure that in future generations, we have the same economic competitiveness that we have now. So we need to make this generational investment in computer science education. So in basically two of the same potential solutions that you might come up with, but you would think about framing the problem in a different way depending on who that audience might be that you're writing towards. I'm happy to say more about that if anybody has questions. I hope it comes off that I'm not talking specifically about the policy or the politics of that, but more that this is an exercise in thinking about who your customer might be and how you can, in this problem and opportunity statement, design it in a way that appeals directly to who that person might be that's receiving the idea. Next, after you outline the problem statement or opportunity statement, what do you want this person to do about it? So a paragraph that basically outlines, here is what you can do and how you can do it. And as I mentioned in the last slide, being very clear and trying to illustrate a roadmap that gives the person the basics of what are the next steps you can take, and here is how you can do it. And that should be the bulk of whatever it is that you're proposing, because you've already, by this point, you've outlined a summary statement, you've included a problem or opportunity statement, and then you've advanced to here's the what and the how. And then finally, how do you plan to follow up? So if this is an email, giving the person very specific guidance, like here's my email, here's my phone number, here's some days that I might be available that we could meet to talk about this. So making sure that there's a clear next step that's been articulated in the document or in the email, so that the person receiving it knows, what are you pursuing next? And then finally, one of the things that the process of writing, I think, can help you with is thinking about what are the unanswered questions that you might not have thought through yet. So I often say, like, keep a piece of paper next to you as you're writing something and think about, what are the questions, the frequently asked questions about this idea that you might not yet have thought through, so that you can keep that as a record, so that, again, thinking about this idea as currency or as a down payment on a future conversation. So if that person that you're writing to says, sure, Graham, I'm excited to talk to you about your idea, here's some availability, you've already gotten a head start in thinking about what questions they might have for you in that meeting. So the writing process itself can help you surface things that might be beneficial, because really what you're working towards is that next conversation. Okay, any questions from the group? Okay, we'll just keep going. So this next portion is really an effort for us to showcase an example proposal. I talked about one example that I worked on. Here's another one from my work that I think kind of highlights some of the key components in a successful memo or policy document. And again, stressing that this is one output. There are several outputs, and I hope that these tips and strategies and way of thinking about persuasive writing can be extrapolated into any kind of output you might be thinking about. And from here, after we go through this document, I'll walk you through a few more tips and tricks. And then together we'll go through taking apart what makes a good persuasive email versus what makes a very bad persuasive email. So just to see here, just a couple things I want to call out. This is a policy proposal that I worked on with a couple of authors last year in the lead up to the new presidential administration. This, I think, does a really good job of capturing, in essence, in a title of a document, what it is that this paper is about. So you can see here directly, it's a very crisp, compelling, punchy title that can help make this piece memorable. So if I were to pick this up, I'm a busy policymaker in DC or in the state capitol in California, in Sacramento, and you're a person that's trying to push me on doing something about how the cost of disasters in the United States, I can see directly from this title, eliminate billion-dollar disasters, equitable science-based US disaster policy for a resilient future. So it captures a lot in just that initial title. So you can think about how in an email, the way that you title the email, like again, thinking about the end user. So if I'm a busy policymaker and I see this and I'm thinking about how the cost of climate change, the costs of disasters in the United States and how it's growing, this might be something I would want to pick up. So then moving into the other components, and I'm not going to read all of this, but just to highlight a few things, this is a really clear problem and opportunity statement, and it starts to also, it can be used in a way as a pitch. So you can see when I talked about bottom line up front, you can see directly here. Every year, Americans lose billions of dollars to natural disasters, hurricanes, wildfires, floods, et cetera, affect millions of Americans and are particularly devastating for low-income communities and communities of color. So straight off the bat, that is one set or two sentences that are very dense and compact, but they're concise and clear. Then the person goes on to articulate what the problem is using the size and magnitude. So trying to show some data, the cause over $1 billion in damage. So again, like that's something that if I'm a policymaker, this person's trying to appeal to my emotion. Wow, that's a lot. And then they offer some specifics on what the policymaker could do about it. Requires all action at all levels of government. And this is foreshadowing for what comes next in the document, which explicitly goes through you policymaker, you end recipient, you audience in my persuasive writing that I'm writing towards. Here is what you can do about it. So this team really thought very deeply about where in the administration, who works on disaster policy, where do they sit, what do they care about, and how can they do something about it? So what is their sphere of influence, and how can we write something that's going to appeal directly to that person and what they might be thinking about? And you can see here some of the specifics. So it's not just what they should do, but how they could do it. A coordinated overhaul of federal laws and policies will inspire change at state and local levels, et cetera, et cetera. And so then the proposal gets more and more detailed. And this is just the summary, one-page summary of the document. But I think it serves as a nice model for you all as you think about outputs you might be striving to create. And so I'll pause there. Any additional questions or any questions at all might be coming in. I seem to have lost the chat again. I don't know what's going on with my Zoom, but Graham, any questions?
None from the chat. Anybody want to jump in with one though?
Okay. Well, feel free, team. We're here and would love to hear if you have questions or thoughts as we're going through. So as I said, we're going to round out the formal presentations in the slides here with some strategies that hopefully can be helpful in thinking through how to create your output, your persuasive writing piece. And I've outlined it in 3 stages. So each stage offers some specific strategies that I and we as a group have found helpful as we're producing these kinds of policy documents or persuasive emails. So the first being before you write. So what is it? What can you actually start to think through in laying out your document and laying out your argument and laying out what it is that you want to say to the person you're writing to? Maria, I see your question here on persuasive and efficient email writing, and I I have something coming up for you where we're going to go through an exercise on writing a persuasive email. So I'm excited to show you that. So preparing before you write. And this aligns directly to how to produce those successful components I talked through of any sort of persuasive writing output. So to create especially to create the problem and opportunity statement, thinking about starting from the end and mapping backwards from there. So what are the successful outcomes that you would expect to see if whatever it is that you're pursuing is actually implemented or changed? So making sure that you have clarity in what you think needs to happen. So what is the future impact that will occur if your organization agrees to do an overhaul of its HR system or to implement that disaster proposal? Like, what is it that will be different about the world, about your organization, if that change is made? And so one of the creative ways we often push people to think about is if a future headline or a future tweet or a future newsletter from your boss was sent out to all the people in your organization showing the impact that you achieved, what would that headline be? So you can see, as I showed in this policy document, this is a very crisp, punchy title. So in some ways, that's what you're starting with when that's what I'm pushing you to think through here, is starting from the end. Like, what is the outcome that you expect to see as a result of this change? I talked about this in the beginning, but I hope if you take nothing else away from me today, it's that you think about who your audience is before you write to them. So who is the target audience? What do you know about them? What drives them in their work and life? What constraints might they be facing related to the issue that you hope to tackle? If you don't know them, do your colleagues know them? Can you do research through Google? If, like, we work on policy, obviously not everybody's policy ideas and the way they think about things are out there in the public, but how could you use research, use your own intuition and being resourceful to understand who the audience is? If you can even get to the level of knowing how they feel about your idea before you send the email, before you write the policy document, you're in a much better spot because you know what to avoid, what not to include, and how to shape the document or the argument in a way that is going to appeal to that person on the receiving end. So developing this audience persona, so who they are, where do they sit, what do they care about, what drives them, all good things to try to map out before you start writing. Similarly, mapping out adjacent stakeholders. So who else is around that person, or who else sits inside the organization or in the community if you're pushing for, related to the stakeholders and trying to change something in your area of focus. Who else is important in the ecosystem related to the idea you're working on or helping to compel action around? So this can be, maybe you're working on pushing a policy idea and it touches the private sector. So how would the private sector feel about it? Or maybe it's an internal issue related to your organization. How would other divisions or offices inside where you sit in the state government feel if this change is put into play? So starting to map out those stakeholders and then think through, if this happens, then how would people feel? It just helps you think about how you structure and shape your argument when you're writing persuasively. If you're working on policy, but even beyond that, like really trying to know the precedents or know what existing actions have already taken place. If this is a tech overhaul, as I mentioned, where you're trying to get your organization to introduce Salesforce, what are the existing customer relation platforms that you utilize? How does technology already implemented and embedded inside your organization? What is the process? What are the rules and regulations? The more you know about that before you start writing, the better, because you can really start to tailor your solution directly and be able to account for and acknowledge these existing actions and precedents in whatever it is that you're pushing for. And then one other thing that I find really helpful is before you start writing to generate a list. It doesn't have to be 25. I just say 25 as a round number. What are the questions that you think you need to think through and make sure you have answers for before you start writing this memo? Just going through that exercise alone will help you think about things you might not yet know. And so this is, again, before you start writing. Still good. I don't see any questions coming into the chat, but we'll continue to encourage you to jump in if you have any. The next is actually putting pen to paper. So some simple things you can do, I think, that can help you start to be structured in the memo or even an email. Sometimes when I start an email, I'll just put dear so-and-so, and then I'll start adding headings into the email. Like, I want to make sure I talk about the cost if this change is implemented. I want to make sure I talk about connections to this person and how I might know them. Whatever it is that you've come up with through this first phase, you can start using those headings to structure the document. Because we write very, very structured policy documents, each sort of has its own, the same flow every time. But if you don't have a template like that, just create one in the writing. What are the main headings, the main points that you want to make sure you hit? Define the problem. I think I talked about this a little bit before in the successful component slide, but really consider your framing as you've started to identify that audience persona. What do you know about the person, and how should that inform the way you frame out the problem? Are there any things you should avoid? Is there specific kinds of evidence or data that you could include that would appeal to the person that's receiving this on the other end? Relatedly, synthesizing the evidence and developing the facts, it's kind of a synchronous process of thinking about problem definition and utilizing evidence. It's like very iterative, and you often have to go back and forth a few times to think about how to get the facts and the evidence right to align directly with the problem. So what I mean by this is, you're using that example of making computer science education available to all students in the United States. Depending on the framing I might take, I would think about, if I was going with more of a diversity angle and the importance of making sure all Americans have access to education, I might think about including evidence that suggests things we're leaving on the table if we don't engage all Americans, especially those in marginalized communities, around computer science education. Whereas if I was making more of the national security competitiveness argument, I might include things like economic data. I might include things like how we're losing out on competition with China. So just, there are facts in both cases, but you would just utilize them and bring them in based on how you want to define and set up the problem. Another piece here, and this doesn't apply to all persuasive writing, but if you can start to articulate, if you are pushing for a change, especially internally to your office, and you're suggesting that something be brought in, what are the costs and what are the benefits? Can you demonstrate that quantitatively? Can you show, if we bring in Salesforce, here's what we can expect from a cost perspective, and here's the return on that investment over time. Show the person that you've done your homework. Shows, again, back to the strategies up front of persuasive writing, like show your credibility that you've actually given this some thought and that you can articulate all elements of it. I'll come back to this question about fonts. It's a good one, and we'll cover it in our in the exercise, and I'll try to hurry up and get there. So I mentioned this before, but giving the person the how, not just the what. So who needs to do what, where, and how they need to do it. So don't just explain what the person on the receiving end can do about it, but give them the how. So describe the actions that you're recommending in as much detail as possible, and be specific. And sometimes this, as I said, can be a little bit of an iterative process. And I think that's why, again, if you take nothing else away, it's like really knowing your customer, because maybe you don't want to give all that detail in one email. Maybe you're thinking about it as a series of things and conversations that you're trying to set up. But these are the best practices. So really trying to give that how. And then I already talked about it, anticipating and addressing questions. So finally, the last stage is editing and refinement. And these are just a few tips and tricks that we use. So can you share it with an expert? Is there somebody else in your organization who you would view as a close colleague or as the foremost expert inside your office on whatever it is that you're writing to, that you could ask them as a subject matter expert to review what you've put together and offer their feedback? Maybe it's just sitting down and having a conversation with them if they're too busy and they don't want to review your actual document. That can help you understand any things that you might not be thinking about. See around some of the corners, what are some of the other potential issues that people inside your organization might be thinking about related to your idea. Read it out loud, or read it to yourself. If you don't have a copy editor, I think this is really important just to hear how it sounds. Like I didn't touch on this too much or really at all yet, but the tone of the email or the tone of the document, like this is really where you can understand, like, how am I sounding? How am I coming off? Am I coming off in the way that this person is going to be open to? So if you read it out loud and it can help you uncover some of the things that you might want to tweak in the final version. Thing I do a lot is just making sure I can set it aside for a day. If this is something, especially maybe less so with an email, but if it's a memo or something I've been working on for a long time, set it aside, give yourself some time away from it, and then return to it, because you come back to it with fresh eyes. You might see something you didn't see before. When you're really immersed in something, sometimes it's hard to let go of where you're at. So really stepping back and then coming back to it to get it over the line and sent out. Remove filler words. So this can kind of help in reading it out loud. You start to see, obviously we write differently than we speak. So that's another thing you can uncover when you're reading something out loud, is like, what are the words in this written document that I could eliminate that help make it more concise? So any filler words, in things like, just too many words, too wordy, I think it comes out in the way you say it. So you start to be able to identify those and then cut it back, and it really helps in making it more crisp and succinct. I mentioned tone. You can use inclusive or expansive pronouns depending on the audience. And I think this is also like organization to organization. Some are more formal, again, like, not to continue to fall back on this, but like really knowing the person you're writing to, you'll be able to understand how formal you need to be. Should you address them as doctor if they have a PhD or an MD? Can you be more, do you want to be more casual because that's the tone you're trying to strike, that you actually like want them to see you at a peer-to-peer level? So there's different ways of thinking about how you do that, but it's really about the person that's on the receiving end. You can eliminate pronouns, things like you, we, them, they, to be more formal in the writing, but I think that's more or less a personal choice depending on the person that you're writing towards. And then always, I talked about this at the top, but just really making it easy for follow-up. Like now, I see people using like, not Doodle, but like these scheduling links. Like, here's a way you can schedule time with me if you want to follow up with this immediately. And here are some blocks of time that I'm available. Like if you want to get to that level, but at a minimum, make sure they know how to reach you. They know how to follow up. Use this interaction as a chance to set up that next conversation, because you always want to be working towards the next thing, right? I said at the beginning, the initial memo, the initial document, the initial idea serves as a down payment for that next conversation. So I'm going to pause here and just take a couple of the questions that are coming in. I'm going to just stop the share of this document, and then I'm going to jump to a different document and walk through an exercise with you. So I have two exercises that we can go through. One will be a sample email I'm just offering for opinions and perspectives and hopefully any questions that might come up. And then we'll allow you to do some of your own work and use some of the time here to start drafting something that you might be interested in putting together. So let me just try to take a couple of these questions. Maria asked some strategies we can use for persuasive and most efficient email writing. I hope that the slides I just covered will give you some of those strategies, Maria, but I'm also going to take you through this example, which can help you do that within the context of an email. Yes, you'll get a copy of the slides. We'll plan to send those right after. What is your view on the use of different font styles? I agree. I do this, but I mean, I know this is, I'm going to run the risk of just saying this is the fallback for everything, but knowing the person you're writing to, if you can, but generally I think I use like bolding or like and I'll show you in my email document. If I'm trying to set aside text or I'm trying to emphasize and make a specific point, I will use like bold or I'll use italics, just to show that there's difference and that if I'm again, like try to make it easy for the person. What are the things I want to make sure they pull out of this? Like, even if it's an email and I'm being really concise, you still have to say what you're thinking about. So, maybe it's 2 or 3 paragraphs. Like, what are the specific things you want the person to pull out? In terms of fonts and email writing, I don't get into that quite as much. I think there are different fonts, like I would say, like depending on the formality, using something like Times New Roman, like that's a pretty formal font. I tend to just use whatever the default is in Gmail because we use Google in my organization, but I think it can be a personal choice. I do think some are better than others, but I think it's about how do you capture the interest and attention of the person that you're hoping will open that email. Adding color, similar, I think I covered that. So I don't think it makes it look less professional necessarily, but I think it kind of depends on the organization, the formality, the professionalism. So for me, generally with all of this, I default to more professional than less if I'm unsure. So I wouldn't use colored font if I was unsure about whether it looked unprofessional. I would always default to the most formal and professional because then I figure like you can't get nicked for that. Like no one's going to say like you were too formal, you were too professional necessarily. Signatures and emails. I think this depends by organization. I think, having a standard default signature is what I do. I turn it off if I'm sending it. Like if it's a formal inquiry or like somebody that doesn't know me, I might, back to what I was saying in the beginning, like to give myself some credibility, I might include my title, where I sit and what organization I'm in. I think it's sort of personal preference. A lot of like, I want people to know the organization I'm at. I want them to know how to reach me. And I want them to know my title because I think it gives me credibility in what I'm trying to do. But I would turn that off if I was like, this is a person that already knows me. So it's kind of personal preference and like trying to understand who you're engaging with. I see people use quotes. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think it kind of depends on the area of work. Like, I work in social change, social impact, policy work. So maybe something that's inspiring and touches that I would be comfortable using. But again, it's sort of personal preference and like where you sit inside your organization. Okay, so I'm going to jump over to my policy doc or my email exercise. So let me share my screen again. So hopefully you can see this. Graham, can you see this? Just give me a thumbs up.
Yep.
Okay. So I have 2 sample emails here. These are real emails. Well, one is a real email. One is one that I was using as a sample. And the first part of this exercise, I'm going to ask you all to just review this short email. And in the chat, just on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being, I would never send this to, 1 being, I would never send this, to 5 being, this is the best email I've ever seen. Rate this email in the chat, and then I invite you to offer an opportunity for improvement. So again, in the chat, share one area you think could be improved, one thing that you notice in this email that could be improved on. And then bonus points if you can suggest a tip or trick that I discussed, or maybe one that you know yourself that could help improve this email. So I'm going to give you a second to write it or to read it, and I'll just make it a little bit bigger. And then again, 1 to 5 in the chat, rating for this email, and then how you might suggest improving. See you. Great. Mostly 2s and 3s. No 1s. Okay. Great. Who is Josh? Why should the reader care? Spice it up. Totally agree. Not a lot of information. Yep. No alternate contact info given. Very informal. Data points. Very good. Who am I? Yeah, I love it. So you all are spot on. I am Josh. I hope just so that it doesn't make any sense, right? I just sign off Josh. I introduce myself, but I don't tell them anything. And the context here was that this was actually a draft email that I put together thinking about trying to solicit interest from a donor organization to provide some support to me for some work that I have undertaken. So as you all rightly point out, well, first off, dear John, as a salutation, have I done the research around who John is? Do I know this person at all? What, maybe they're a doctor, maybe maybe I need to give them more of a title and recognize who they are in the opening. I introduce myself, but I don't say anything about where I work, what I do. No context is given. So if this is the first foray in my interaction with this person, if I was on the receiving end of this, I wouldn't necessarily know what to do. I might just think that this should have been caught by my spam filter. So then I go on, and it's fairly indescript. I am interested in supporting USAID. So I write USAID. I'm assuming this person would know what that meant, but that's an acronym, right? So I don't write that out. I should write out the United States Agency for International Development to find solutions for climate change. Like, what kind of solutions? Why are you writing to me about this? I have a lot of great ideas, and this is an important problem for many communities. Again, a fairly indescript statement. But so I would probably want to say more about what do I mean by great ideas? I recognize this is an important problem. What is the size and scale of this problem? Can you tell me, can you offer some evidence that would show me you've actually thought this through? And when you say communities, what communities are you talking about? What if I'm a person on the receiving end that only works with communities in the Midwest in the United States? Or what if I work in Canada? It's pretty indescript. And then again, like, I know your foundation funds climate change. Does that doesn't really, if I was on the receiving end of that, I would say this person hasn't really done their homework to understand much about what we do. A better email could, you might say, I know you fund climate change and here are the ways you do it. And here is how it aligns with the solutions that I'm thinking about. So when I talked about that problem, opportunity, and solutions alignment, so you're sort of starting to structure it in a way in the narrative that you've set up the problem. And it's very clear for the person on the receiving end to understand what you're suggesting we do about it. Someone told me you work on it with your partner ABC Group. So this could be an opportunity for you to be specific. Like there may be cases where you don't want to reference the person that told you to reach out, but is that a person that you trust? Is that a person that knows them that they might trust? So that can give you some level of credibility if you've been referred by a person within the network. So you can see how in your organization, if you're trying to push for something to be done, maybe if you don't know the person, like, do you have colleagues that know that person? And can you reference them in the writing so that, again, like your goal here is to persuade and push for change to happen. So citing somebody else can help validate who you are and what you're trying to do. And someone told me that you work on it. Work on what? You know, that's pretty indescript. So when I said like try to avoid pronouns, that's a good example where if you were specific about what the pronoun is, you could give the person more to work with, describe what it is that you're thinking about. And then lastly, which I think a few of you pointed out, I would be excited to talk to you about my ideas and hope to hear from you. So it's sort of like a Hail Mary, right? Like, please, I hope to hear from you. There's no follow-up given. I don't have my email signature here. So there's no way for, even if somehow by the grace of God, this person was interested in following up with me, there's no way for them to do that. I haven't made it easy for them. So you use the email again to set it up so that it's clear in how they get in touch with you. But I'm going to stop there and see if you have questions about this or any further comments. And then I have an actual email that I did send, and I'm opening myself up to criticism because you all now can critique a real email that I wrote to a funder. So I would love to hear though if you have questions about this, because I know there was a lot of interest in persuasive email writing. And feel free to come off mute or just throw more questions in the chat. I'm just going to take 30 here and give you all a second to think. Good question, Mark. I probably would give this, I don't know, because I'm harsh on myself, I'd probably give it a 1. But I could get behind a 2 because I think most of you are probably right. There's some elements here that work. It's just, if you're from a persuasive email standpoint, I would probably give this a 1 because it's not really persuading anybody to do anything. Would your footer ID, good question. I would say no. I would be specific about this. So the question is, would your footer ID be adequate for getting back to you if this actually succeeded in getting someone's attention? I would say no. I would be very explicit. Here is how, so the way I do it, and you can critique me in the next email, but I give people, I let them know how they can reach me and how I plan to follow up if I don't, or how they can follow up with me. I'd love to identify a convenient time for us to meet. Here are some options for me that work next week if you are willing to talk with me. So I'm not assuming that they're going to take the meeting, but if they are, here are some options. So you're trying to make it easy. You're trying to set it up so that next conversation is seamless and it's going to happen if the person's interested. Would this be a good outline to build off when starting your writing? I think it is, yes. I think there's a lot more you could do here. And we'll see in the next piece if you think I did a good job evolving it to a spot that somebody might respond to. But any other questions, please keep dropping them in. So part 2 here is essentially using this same model. So again, I'm going to ask you to rate the email on a scale of 1 to 5. 1 being poor and 5 being the best email you've ever seen. And please be harsh, because this is a real email I wrote, and we can all, as I said, it's a lifelong practice of improving writing. I guess a few people are gifted with it when they're born, but I was certainly not. So please, I'm open to your feedback, and then opportunities for improvement. So rate me, and then if you have one idea or thing that could be improved, or if there's something in it that you think really works well, feel free to add that in too. So this one's a little longer, so I'll give you a freebie in saying that it probably could be more concise, but I'm going to try to make it a little smaller so we can get it on one screen. Can you all see that? I think you really just need to focus on this part of it. Okay, so feel free to drop in ratings whenever you have a chance to finish. And any feedback you have for me could be what needs to be improved, what you liked about it, and or any questions you have about what I might have done here. Great. Wendy, I like it. I like it. Not specific is what I want from the recipient. Okay, could be more specific. Good. I didn't include my phone and email info. Very good. I lacked including because I usually have a default setup, so I forgot to copy over my signature, but that's great. Great. Could have put the acronym in. I spelled it out. Could be more direct. Great. Include the first part in the yeah. Okay, great. Yeah. So I could have brought that up front, right? The bottom line up front statement. Tyke Rod too. Sorry, I don't know your name, but that's great. A great observation that I could have brought up. The bottom line up front is that I'm trying to unlock private finance, right? So I could have put that up top. More brevity, spell grammar check. I didn't do that. Awesome. So yeah, you can see how the evolution was quite dramatic, but there's always ways to improve. And like, not all of you will have a chance to come and teach a class on persuasive writing and ask people to critique you, but you might be able to find a friend or somebody in your office to take a look, because you never know what you might miss. And as many of these emails as I write all the time, I'm still I'm not perfect. A couple other things I wanted to point out. We didn't talk about this in the first version of the email, but the title, talk about climate change, that doesn't tell me much if I'm on the receiving end of that. I tried to improve the title here to be punchy, mobilizing $3 billion in funding to tackle the global climate crisis. Other things I've done here that can help. Like I could have that title, and then maybe I say connection from Daniel Jones, right? So Daniel Jones is a colleague who knows Dr. Smith that referred me to him. So if I put Daniel Jones in the title of my email, the likelihood that this person might see it and open it increases because they know, oh, Daniel Jones, like I like that person, because otherwise I wouldn't have used the reference if I knew that. So again, like I did my homework. I understood who Dr. Smith was. I knew that they were a PhD, so I should use doctor in the title. That's just a quick Google search. I was referred, I found somebody in my network who knew them. So in this case, Daniel Jones, and Daniel Jones knew them well enough for me to understand that, hey, that is a useful connection for me. I should include it in my email. And, you know, as I showed, you can adapt the title, because at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is get this person to open the email and to respond to you. So other things that I did from one version to the next. Yeah, this is good, Graham. For a 20-minute Zoom, that's really good. So I didn't include the amount of time I'm asking for. That's something that I think is really valuable to do, especially for people that are busy. I only need 15 or 20 minutes. Like, here are some times that I'm available. So let me just take you through a couple other things that I did from one version to the next. I tried to highlight my organization, which you saw. I tried to reference that, like, again, I had done the homework on this person. I know they're interested in climate resilience and they focus on this in their work. So I wanted to acknowledge that in the email so that they can see that, hey, I've spent time actually thinking about this. As some of you pointed out, I could have been even more specific here, which is right. I could have been more specific around, why am I writing you? Like, what are this, when you use the word solutions, what does that actually mean? And then I went on to like try to connect to something they would care about. So I gave them specifics. I used this big dollar amount as like a headline figure, like, you know, big $3 billion. Like, that's something that's an attention grabber. Somebody's going to care about that and want to open it and look through it. I acknowledge some existing work. Like, these are, so a precedent that's happening. This is an executive action inside the White House. They're thinking about this. You should also be thinking about this. I've done my homework. I know that this is something you might care about. I talked about East Africa, where you and your colleagues spend a lot of time. So again, appealing to this person's emotion. If they're a funder and I'm trying to get them to give me money and I know they care about East Africa and this is an issue that touches East Africa, that can appeal to their emotion. They might actually be more willing to respond because I've tapped into something that they care about. And then, oh, sorry, and I kind of skipped over this because it's an email, but actually at the bottom of this, what I did, I couldn't really share it on the whole screen, but this is another trick that I often use is if I've written a full 4-page document that actually outlines a concept that I'm looking for this person to fund. And what I did was I just synthesized it in this email. So I wrote the email as a topper, and then below I have a summary of the project. So that's another way, and I'll send this stuff over to you after so you can actually interrogate it a little bit more on your own and see what you think works. But I basically outlined in here like some of the stuff in the concept in this longer page document that they might be excited about funding. So it's just another strategy. So if you're like, I want to write a policy memo or a memo to my colleagues that communicates this specific thing I want to see changed, you can add that as an attachment, which I highlighted in here. I outline a summary of our approach and work below and include a more detailed concept note in the attachment to this email. So you can attach the document. That's the longer form thing that you've written up, but you're actually giving them a preview of what's in there below in the email in case they don't want to open it or they're too lazy to open it. All I have to do is just read this email to know what's in that document. And then I give specifics on what I'm looking for. I could have been more specific, which a couple of you pointed out. We are looking for partners to collaborate on this while also seeking to identify funding to help get this off the ground. So very specific. And then I said, here's how I want to follow up. I'm available to speak at your convenience. So, you know, treating them like my customer. I'm not going to assume it should be based on my convenience. It's when they're available, and happy to organize a time for us to talk over Zoom. Graham pointed out, giving the actual time increment that you're looking for is really valuable, especially if you do only need 15 minutes or 20 minutes. And then some suggested dates that work for me. So try to get specific so you make it easier for them to respond with a time. And I'd be happy to share a calendar invite. Again, make it easy. You want to have a way for them. You want to make it easy for you to get that conversation. If you do some of the legwork, be willing to send out the invite, put it on your calendar. The other advantage you have then is you own the invite. So you know when it's happening, you can plan, you can prepare. You've got a little bit more control over what happens. So I'll take any more. I'm going to just stop my screen share. And then I have one more thing we can run through as a group just to hear some of your ideas. But I'm open to any questions you might have. And I'm going to jump back into the main Zoom here. What about adding how they can benefit from this opportunity? Great question and great suggestion. You can do that. I offered that as one of my tips. If you can even give it in like a cost benefit analysis, like if you do X, we will get Y. That's a really good way to communicate that if you can get to that level of specificity. How effective is internal problem solving via an email thread? I don't think it's very effective. That's just personal preference. I think getting on the phone with somebody, you can always hash out in more nuance. Things can be misconstrued in written language, right? Especially in email, if people are going back and forth quickly, tone isn't always well received or can be misconstrued. Sometimes people don't get into the full nuance in writing of what the actual issues are. I also think you're leaving a written record if you write something down, whereas if you're having a conversation with somebody, you leave yourself a little bit more leeway. A written document, a written email is very definitive and in some ways finite. So I personally prefer, especially if it's a controversial issue, to try to hash it out on a call or in person if I can. Especially the world we live in now with everything in social media. It's kind of an example of how things can spiral out of control because of what people write. So that's just my take on it. What about focus on the passion of climate control that you shared together? Terry, I'm not sure if I fully get your question here, but I think that's exactly what I was trying to shoot for, is like bridging our shared passion and bringing it together in the email, and making sure this person can see that and feel it. Yeah, I think you can state it in the email for sure. Yeah, I do like, sometimes I write those kinds of statements, like we have a shared passion for this particular issue. And you can even put that in the email title. I've done that. Like, it just kind of depends on the person you're writing towards. Okay, any other questions or reactions? I hope that was helpful, especially since we did it in an email, because I know I use the policy document in my slides, but I want to show you how, as I said, a lot of the tips and tricks I was talking through can really be used for any kind of diverse, persuasive document you might be looking to write, whether it's email or memo or presentation, or in my case, a funder email and a potential proposal. Okay, so I'm going to pop back into my slides, and I just have one other exercise. And we're going to take about 5 minutes on this one. I kind of ran long on that last one, but it'll just give each of you a chance, or hopefully a volunteer, if there is one, that wants to offer up something you might be thinking about. So just bear with me again here. Okay. Whoops. Okay, so I know each of you are sort of working on something different. So I was hoping we could start with just, if anybody is willing and brave to throw their idea in the chat and serve as a little bit of a guinea pig, this would be an opportunity for us to crowdsource input on something you might be thinking about. So if there is a volunteer out there that would like to raise their hand and come off mute, we can try to talk through an idea you might be thinking through. We don't have to do this, but at a minimum, I would love to hear some of the ideas that you might be thinking through. And so I know we asked you to do this off the top. So if you don't mind, if there is a particular issue that you're thinking about that you might be stuck on in your own writing, we can use this time to try to do some consulting here for the last few minutes of our course. Any brave soul out there? Okay, then let's try something a little different. I'll just walk you through this template and show you how it can be used. And then
Josh, we got one there.
Oh, great. Mark.
Mark is willing to share.
Okay. Mark, maybe you could just introduce yourself, where you are, where you physically sit, your organization, and specifically this issue you might be thinking about.
Yeah, I unmuted. I'm sitting in Trenton. I'm the assistant director with New Jersey State Parks and Historic Sites. We seek to have a broader storyline with all of our storytelling and interpretation of our cultural sites to include everyone's stories and move away from the traditional wealthy white man, important figure story. Our professional staff lack diversity themselves in terms of who currently holds all of our professional titles. We want to reflect more of the culture of today and diversity and need assistance to do that. How do we engage education and teaching and curriculum to get people excited about learning about their own history so they can see a reflection of that? That's the problem statement.
Okay, great. So I have a couple ideas, but I would welcome the group here to ask any clarifying questions over the chat that you might have for Mark, and any specific ideas that might help him get started. And Mark, maybe I could just offer one follow-up question would be, where are you in the process of working on this? Is this, say have you already gotten it started? Is it something that's still in the ideation stages where you're trying to think through what to do? Is
Just
it
beginning.
mandated? Yeah. Where are you at?
Embryonic, just beginning the conversation to reflect our goals of social equity and environmental justice. We want to see cultural interpretive justice paired as well within New Jersey. So we are just beginning.
Okay. And is the desired track, I mean, you mentioned education, is that where you've landed as the solution, or is it that just one of the areas you're thinking about?
One area, so that we have a deeper pool of candidates that are more diverse in terms of their cultural and racial background, so that when we can onboard hourly full-time employees, we have a broader pool. How do we engage the education communities in our state so that history is being seen as something they feel welcome into and
Great.
be a part of?
Awesome. Okay, so first up, I would have asked the same question. I think, Sarah, you've definitely been paying attention, or you think about this in your own work. The audience you might be thinking about here, Mark, and I think even a step before that I might suggest is just doing a little bit of stakeholder mapping. So trying to, and maybe you've done this, but trying to understand the landscape and ecosystem of people, actors, both within the state government, but outside constituents, stakeholders, groups that might either be working on this or have a perspective about it. As you start to think about the potential opportunities for solutions. And then within that, because you're inside the state government, like what sort of existing action has already been taken that might touch this particular issue, and especially if you're focusing in on education as one of the solutions. So those will just be a couple ideas for me. And if you want to follow up with me, I also have a landscape analysis deck that I can send you that would walk you through how I would do that.
Thank you.
So those are just a couple thoughts. And then Wendy had an idea on whether it has to go through review. That's a great question. I think starting understanding, and this is something I didn't necessarily point out, but because many of you sit within government, I'm sure risk is one of a factor in the order of priority that's probably fairly high in thinking about what you can write and how you can tell a story. So making sure you've identified what sort of checks are in place that you need to run through on the front end. So that would come out in some of the stakeholder mapping of thinking about what is the process and who are how do I actually get something done around this issue area. Annette had an idea about thinking about what towns are already working on this. So that's great. And I think when you start to do stakeholder mapping, it serves as both opportunities. So specific examples that you might want to point to or things that you can build on that of groups, organizations, towns that are already taking this issue on and what they're doing about it. But also it starts to show you who might run in opposition to what you're trying to do. Because anytime you're trying to change something, of course, there are going to be people that are entrenched and don't want to see it changed. So that's the value of doing some stakeholder analysis, of thinking about who all the different groups are. And yeah, it is, because it's a hot button issue around diversity, of course, trying to think about having different perspectives and people review it. And I think we didn't talk much about this, but especially when you're thinking about diversity, of course, diversity of thought, diversity of demographic diversity, there's all sorts of different kinds of diversity that can inform a way a person would perceive an idea. And so in the review of whatever you put together, making sure you have diverse people take a look at it, I think is a great idea. Any other thoughts for Mark? Mark, any follow-up questions? We have a couple more minutes.
No, thank you. That was very good. I don't mean to monopolize the time. I know there's other
No,
topics.
we
but
appreciate
this is
you
good.
jumping in and engaging. It's really helpful. So, and definitely I'll share my contact info at the end for everybody, but please follow up if you want to talk more about what you're working on.
Thank you.
And that extend that to all of you that have joined today. Well, just in our last couple minutes, then I wanted to just show you this other template, and it was an exercise we were going to run through, but just so you have it as another takeaway, this document that I shared, so this is just a series of prompts that sort of build on what we talked about in the slide deck. It can help you diagnose your audience. So if you run through these questions, just start using this as a little bit of a workbook or cheat sheet that can help you start to diagnose the various components of things you might want to think through on the front end before you start writing. So diagnosing the audience, this kind of gets into what I was talking about with Mark, of just thinking through the landscape of actors, the stakeholders, people this issue might touch. But really in your writing, you want to get to a level of specificity where you can actually envision a person on the receiving end of this. Think about a real person, where they sit, what they know, who they are, what drives them, what makes them mad, things like that, that can help you shape the idea. This section on bluff, which I think we've hit on, but draft a short summary of 3 to 5 sentences that outlines the problem and recommended action. Another section for you to do that. And then finally, I talked about a headline. And these are, again, just some tips and tricks that can help you get started as you start to write up a document. But the headline, it could be that, think about it as there's different ways of being creative. In Mark's case, like, Mark, what's the future New York Times headline that would be in in the paper that would show what happened as a result of the change in getting your idea implemented. So starting from the end and thinking about what are the outcomes you want to achieve and getting really specific about that. And here are some different examples in this document that you could use and draw on. But that really helps you think about what are you organizing toward? Like, what is the document trying to get done? You want to make sure you, as the writer, have clearly articulated that before you set out and trying to persuade somebody else to get behind your idea. Okay, and with that, those are my parting thoughts for today. As I said, we will share all of these resources with you all. Graham, who you may know already, is a great conduit to me and to our team here. But would love to hear what you thought. And as a group, we offer these trainings often, and Graham can share more of those details as well. But thanks for joining today. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you all. And I know the work that you do is often potentially overlooked, but it's incredibly vital to the success of the states that you work in. So I just want to encourage you to keep pushing for the things that you want to see done out there in the world.
Thank you so much, Josh. And as Sandy asks, we will send the slides out. Josh will send his contact info, so feel free to follow up. Feel free to follow up with me. And I just dropped into the chat a link to our next training on Thursday on data and government, which I think is going to be a really interesting and good session. So feel free to sign up for that one or for any of our future sessions. And thanks to all of you for joining today.
Thank you so much.